In the current status quo, individuals who unfortunately have to reside within rural areas are left there to rot. They are refused the most basic access to the most basic conveniences that any person in the city will be able to automatically receive. On government, we oppose to this current social phenomenon, and that's why we're so proud to propose. First, setup then. What does our model look like? A, we will legally pay individuals to migrate from highly populated cities to more rural areas. The payment here specifically will be sufficient to sustain these people's lives for a period of time until those rural areas can be able to supply their demands for jobs, food, convenience, access, etc. This is government fiated, right? B, however, each individual has the autonomy to accept or reject this offer. That is why opposition can't claim we're stripping away these people's rights to live where they want to. But C, and most importantly, this project will be done on a large scale, i.e. moving large groups of people to each rural area. Therefore, the major impact here is that private corporations will be naturally inclined to establish factories, centers, etc. as this is an insane business opportunity with a large supply of newfound customers. 3 points in context then. First, highly competitive job markets is a common norm in highly populated areas, and many are struggling from this phenomenon. But secondly, rural areas are neglected by private institutions as well as the governments themselves, and usually targeted as the location for environmentally destructive projects. For example, factories that destroy the environment, right? But third and most finally, residents of rural areas are refused the easy access to basic conveniences, for example, properly invested in schools or hospitals, right? Well, without further ado, to our first claim then, on why we support more universal development and more even allocation of resources on our side of the house. The premise here is rural areas deserve the same treatment that highly populated areas receive. 3 things. Firstly, most of the residents here are likely to be poor. Secondly, they are the most in need of a boosting pad to break through social barriers, i.e. properly invested in schools. But thirdly, most are likely to be either unemployed or have opted for extremely risky, dangerous, and inadvisable labor jobs. For instance, manual farming. 2 pieces of mechanism under this argument there. A, we better employment chances for the people here, and we improve work efficiency. How will this happen? 3 things. A, our model clearly suggested that this project would be carried out on a large scale, therefore meaning large groups of people flocking to an uninvested rural area. B, the rich who already have a stable income in cities will not likely to take up this offer and migrate. Thus, it's safe to say the opportunities that government provides you today are exclusive to the poor who are willing to migrate to a different location for the payment only, right? But C, most importantly, private corporations will see this as a golden business opportunity and they will want to invest as soon as possible into those regions to gain the first mover advantage and supply for a very potential source of customers. 2 things under this claim. A, this means that there will be more job opportunities for the currently struggling population of those rural areas. But B, those jobs will most likely be less manual and hard compared to what the people in rural areas had to do before our model took place. Why then will these companies not replace currently existing jobs in rural areas, but merely increase and boost the efficiency of those jobs? The premise here is most of the investments from those companies will go to agricultural jobs, right? 2 things then. Firstly, to start up a completely new business and working environment comes at an extremely high price. These companies operate on a profit-based regime, therefore, they're likely to opt for the most profitable and least expensive choice of investment. Secondly, on the flip side, these farmers or people in rural areas already have a basic and stable foundation within their respective fields of expertise. For example, sufficient lands to farm on, techniques of planting crops being mastered, etc. Companies, therefore, will not replace these farmers, but instead establish contractual agreements to collaborate with these people to elevate their efficiency of work through introducing new technology, because building a completely new farm is obviously more expensive than working with the farmers who already have a basic foundation there. B then on why we improve better access to basic facilities. With employment and construction of brand new infrastructure, this means residents in rural areas can have easy access to these facilities better than ever. And notice how the current major issue in those areas here is healthcare being very limited. Only on governments where these rural areas have a sufficient supply of citizens, governments will be incentivized to build hospitals there. Only then will the lives of these people who are the most in need be ensured in terms of quality. For all reasons above, vote in favor of.
What an irresponsible way for government to come out and say that they will pay people to go to rural areas, which basically we have the same fiat to mention that we will actually develop the urban areas in order for people to much more have a better job opportunity and whatsoever, which I'll also mention in our team's model. Our team's model in today's speech is we want to achieve a better balance and development between the urban areas and the rural areas. So 2 models in today's speech. Firstly, our alternative is that we will have better welfare system and build more workforces for migrants with the same same fiat that government has for the amount of money that they will pay individuals. B, we would want people to rather than we would want people rather than people going to we would want people to naturally go to their rural areas by their own wills, rather than the government trying to incentivize these people to go. So to end, two pieces of framing. Firstly, what kind of people are affected? People are affected by this kind of payment will be the poor people, because they urgently need the payment. This means that the rich people who would be in the populated areas, while poor people who need the money would be pressurized to go to rural areas by their economic status in the status quo. And even if the highly populated areas are not important, you still have the following problems in these kind of areas. We believe there is a lack of pre-existing jobs and infrastructures, then people actually fall more into poverty, and you must burden-proof this. Now moving on to our team rebuttal, two pieces. So firstly, their team has mentioned about the government will most likely focus on the rich classes of the urban areas. However, two layers. Firstly, we never suggest that we only focus on these kind of classes. In fact, in our model, we say that we help the poor people in the urban areas through welfare systems, solving fundamental problems within society and etc. And B, and regarding people that are poor in rural areas, we also state that given the government has so much money to carry out this project in a very big scale, we also have the fiat to, for example, to give incentive for these people to move to urban areas. And there's also mentioned about less competitiveness in the market. However, firstly, we don't believe that this is true. And if you move on to a large influx of people to rural areas, then you in fact harm the competitiveness in the rural areas, because you only allow for people outside actors such as powerful companies to come into rural areas, only harming the fair competition in these areas. Moving on to our team first argument about more people in concentrated the urban areas is much more cost effective. Two layers. So firstly, premise, when the government focuses more on urban areas in our world, it can better develop the urban areas, also utilizing our team's policy that where we had mentioned that we would develop these kind of urban areas. Then be about impact. So firstly, why urban areas are so important. Urban areas are so important in today's debate because of the single effect that they're urban. Then what does this mean? This means that the urban areas are much more important because they house the most amount of people, and also there are also the fact that there's a lot of education in urban centric, meaning that innovation and overall development usually occurs in the urban areas as well. And also about balanced development. So firstly, the government chooses to neglect the development of urban development, and this means that at the end of the day, they cannot progress further as a state because they fail to recognize the importance of the urban hub. And also secondly, and simply focusing on every single rural areas to have the same capacity is only going to do so much. And even if it's possible, you lost a valuable resource and time that you could have instead went to a valuable development of urban places. Now move on to our second argument about harmful for the rural areas as well. Three layers. Firstly, premise, we believe that even if we lose on a trade-off of the importance of rural areas, the government fails to develop these rural areas at the best anyways. Then be wise this. If there is suddenly a large influx of people coming to these kind of rural areas, given that the policy and government is even feasible in the first place, then this causes some problems such as inflation and foreign investments. And lastly, why is this detrimental? We believe that this is very detrimental because of in the government's role. In fact, this destroys the local economy because through the sudden increase of people rushing into the area that isn't even properly developed, rural areas suffer, and the impact is so significant because when you don't have the capacity to handle economic challenges, the thing here is that you can't afford basic necessities such as education, the right to food, and even afford housing.
I know when these people in these rural areas are dying because they do not have healthcare, that is where proposition comes in to save them, right? When the opposition neglects these people in rural areas, the poorest and the most vulnerable, proposition here is going to save them. Right? Three layers of contentions, right? Firstly, right, not the fact that most of their points and their policy, the whole case in general, is literally just about everyone moving to urban areas, right? Why is this so detrimental, right? Because one of the main impacts that PM has given to you throughout this debate is that healthcare, right? Is that if there's a huge amount of people moving into these areas, there would be actually a demand for healthcare, right? Previously before, right? There's been so little people and there's not that much population that these healthcare companies don't even bother to build healthcare or pharmacy there because they don't see a big profit increase, because they don't see that they can get a profit from those areas. Now that there's more people and more population, going into these areas, more likely than not, these companies now have a very, very big incentive to build these healthcare industries, right? To build all of these pharmacies, right? I think this was stated very, very clearly by PDM, and this would prove detrimental to their case, because none of the fact that we can prove every single one of their benefits of helping and providing jobs with our own, right? Oh, right, you provide jobs in urban areas by pushing people to move over there, right? But then again, not the fact that at the end of the day, our side also has that, right? And finally, right, this impact is even more detrimental, right? This impact is the most exclusive impact of them all, is overpopulation, right? Is that these cities, even if they are urban and even if they're extremely developed, overpopulation can lead to, for example, overcrimes, right? For example, huge amounts of people and barely any housing, right? If their side wants to talk about, for example, all these urban areas, we tell you about overpopulation, right? One city or a few cities cannot hold that much people, right? Rather than we try to spread out these people, and rather than we try to spread out all these people, we would rather that and really not find the problem of overpopulation and deaths, right? But secondly, right, not the fact they talk something about, for example, this local economy collapsing because hundreds and hundreds of people flock over there and just really improving and just really giving companies an incentive to build factories there, right? We don't really see how this is the problem, right? They talk about how these people do not have enough money to have education, to have all that stuff, but not in the fact that in our policy, we already have a fiat that provides these people a decent amount of money for living in the near future, right? So not in the fact that by the time this money somewhat runs out, these factories and these companies would already build all these stuff and these people can now get a job in, right? So not the fact that after everything clears out, proposition stands here with this very strong impact and a very detrimental harm to deaths, right? Overpopulation, right? Once everything clears out, we accept the policy as being charitable as possible. Everything clears out, and their side has a very, very major flaw, which I stated over and over again, is overpopulation, right? That there's too many people that's being fitted into a city, and instead of spreading it out, it chose to stay in there, right? What would this be, and how this is the winning point and the path of victory to proposition, right? But before that, we would like to, for example, on both worlds, right? Let's take on a worst case scenario, right? Worst case scenario, just like they said, right? Maybe, for example, some of these people, or maybe there's some competition, right? Maybe, for example, some of these local areas might perceive some competition, right? But then again, even after these local people, and even after, for example, even if some of these farmers, some of these local people lose their jobs, they still have other jobs. That is to say that even if as a local person I lose my job, there's still other jobs that, for example, these companies or these factories still provide that might somewhat mitigate that, right? That's a worst case scenario, right? On the normal case scenario, we get, for example, all these companies going over, right? All these companies putting and building factories, more people get jobs, and a very, very good economy in these places, right? These places before have a very, very low economy, and kind of you support for proposition because we support all these local areas. We support the most vulnerable and never been prouder to propose.
Panel, at the end of the day, we believe that rural areas and urban areas are not, it should not be biased in a governmental policy, and we believe that our side is best able to fulfill the overall development of a state. And we, at the end of the day, even if government claims that urban areas are not that important, we still believe that we take care of the most important actors, the actual citizens. Why is this? I'll first explain our rebuttals regarding the government and our last argument, right? Okay, so what government first comes out and says in this debate is that there's an importance of poor people in rural areas, and this is the deadlock that I first noticed. Like, firstly, we frankly do not care. We say that if we can focus on the general development of the whole country by focusing on the main economic sector, once again, we explain how this is the urban areas. We explain you how we focus on these areas. We're able, at the end of the day, we are also able to develop, and we're actually, in fact, we have the better fiat to develop the rural areas using these new developed urban areas. And secondly, even if they're so important, note that our LO clearly explains how your world harms these poor people in the rural area further, right? We tell you again and again how if you move these people to rural areas, you encourage one, inflation and foreign companies to flow in so much that the local economy is in fact harmed. I will further elaborate in my argument. Two, even if this is not true, using government's own characterization of the poor people, the main ones moving into these areas, they don't encourage development, because how are these exact same people who you characterize as being so desperate and not educated can make so much change and development in these
undeveloped areas. In fact, you further depolarization and discourage development because you only keep the rich people in the urban areas, and you kind of create this segregative nature, and you actually you harm the poor people in the rural areas further, right? They also say that there's overpopulation and dispersion, which they cannot hold these much people. Firstly, we mentioned that we are going to develop the urban areas, providing welfare and trying to fix poverty, and we don't see a problem over here anyways, because even though they're overpopulated, with the model that we have, we're able to make a good environment in the place and actually develop them, compared to the government team, who are basically spending all the money that the government has to spend people to the rural areas, then not being able to develop, which is also the mechanism over why their team cannot help poor and the most vulnerable people, which I will also mention in my substantive. In talking about my substantive, I'll mention our last argument, which is regarding the class difference. The premise here is that purposely paying people to move into rural areas further the polarization of the class difference and accelerate de-accelerate the development of rural areas. Why is this? 4 layers. As we've and they've already characterized, and we conceded this, people who move in large numbers to these rural areas are mostly poor who want to search for a better life. B, rural areas in the status quo already is stagnating economically, especially given that the fact in the status quo, automation is rapidly accelerating. You can't ignore the fact that these communities will be more replaceable, as these communities aren't adaptable due to the fact that 1, conservative political ideologies exist, 2, primal industries such as farming, manufacturing, mining, forestry, and those industries that are much more likely to be replaced by these mechanizations. C, rural areas are more likely to be the ones that become massively reliant on national governments, who have to spend huge amounts of capital propping up welfare and housing for these communities. Government team cannot mention that developing these rural communities will be independent, because they don't explain the mechanism how they will become independent and they will not become reliant. Developing countries especially are likely to be harmed by this. Lastly, inflation. Different things such as price of houses would inflate, because as people suddenly move so much, there will be massive increase in the demand, yet the production of these supplies would stay the same, meaning that necessities such as houses, basic food, and things like that would massively increase in prices. And foreign investment, they never engage in this point. Lastly, the impact here is that their world is further polarized because they purposely segregate the poor and the rich. This is so crucial, and because we can simply rebut to their entirety of their case using this premise. Secondly, we don't believe the fact that this is true. If you move a large influx of people to rural areas, then you in fact harm the competitiveness in the rural areas, because you only allow for outside actors such as powerful companies to come into rural areas, only further harming the competition and further harming the vulnerable. And this is why we're so proud to oppose in today's debate. Thank you.
Panel, the people we are discussing in this debate today are the people who live in favelas in Brazil, are the people who have been robbed of jobs, are the people who have to stay homeless annually and generationally. And we think that proposition is the only side that can fix this problem. Do a few pieces of response. Opposition quite literally bank their whole case on the fact that these governments will use that fiat to fix these areas either way. 2 structured reasons why they are not incentivized to do so. Number 1, it's a massive waste on their side of the house, because there's no point in developing these rural areas when nobody is moving there in the first place. We think that cities will always be more prioritized than urban area by citizens for clear reasons. This means the proposition fix this by pushing people to go to these areas with money. Therefore, private courts will flock to there naturally, and government are then incentivized to develop these areas. Opposition case does not work. But second reason, we just simply don't see this happen in the status quo. The reason why we debate this motion in the first place is because the problem of low development in rural area is a problem that has not been fixed by most nations. So for example, favelas in Brazil or rural areas in Europe, these are serious problems, and that is why this is a debate in the first place. But let's jump into the most important clashes. We think the most important clash that has been conceded by both teams are people in rural areas. But a few crucial notes, we think that the most important thing is that we need to sustain these people actual job opportunities, considering how most people living in these rural areas lack job opportunity, and that leads to things like, for example, not being able to have food on the table or not being able to pay tax. So let's compare 2 sides. On opposition, they bank their whole case on the fact that many people who move to these areas, so overpopulation happens. 2 reasons why this is quite literally irrelevant then. Reason number 1, we've already framed it from PM pretty clearly clearly. Only the minority of society that is so desperate for money that are willing to throw away literally everything to go into these rural areas in the first place. Therefore, it is safe to say that this claim was never needed by their side of the house. But secondly, let's take their world and say that rural areas will be overpopulated on our world then. This is the exact reason why all of our impacts on private and governmental investment stands, because these institutions would definitely invest in areas with large amount of supply of consumers. This means that they only help our case more, and this is a total contradiction to their side of the house. They made another negative point on why jobs will be taken away in those rural areas, and they say automation is popularized, etc. Response are in a few fold. Number one, in the status quo, people in rural areas are already struggling with limited opportunities. That is because there is a limited demand for products, considering how the population in these areas are extremely little. Thus, let's say some jobs can be replaced by those companies, it still isn't detrimental to our case, because at least we do give these people, and the majority of them, actual jobs in which they don't give on their side of the house. But secondly then, PM has pretty much stated from the get-go that quota are naturally incentive to collaborate with the farmers there. They fail to realize how expensive it is to start up a brand new agricultural business. Therefore, the only plausible thing here is that these private corps work with those farmers, work with people that are in skilled labor in order to improve the technologies, things like that. On government then, we proved a few things in this debate in order to win this crucial clash that is the most important thing. We created a direct incentive for corporations to move to these rural areas. Two crucial impacts then we have proven that quite literally have won us the whole debate. Number one, more jobs for people living in these rural areas. This means two things. More development in these rural areas. So for example, better architecture, better public goods. This is since governments are incentivized to invest into areas that boost their economy, to attract even more people, to boost their economy even more. But we help these people that are moving to these areas. As we already framed, the majority of people willing to throw their life away are these people in the extreme minority, are these people who are suffering from social economic desperation, which means that on our side of the house, these people moving here means that they will gain more jobs, means that they have a first mover advantage, and they can more easily apply for these corporations as a whole. This is our trade-off then. We accept that these jobs are low paying. However, we'd rather these people be able to have a stable income than to be homeless in a major city that doesn't care about them. This is why you propose.
I'd like to briefly clarify that. Firstly, their side is not helping rural areas help poorer people get better jobs. This is simply not likely. Government has failed to explain how companies would be incentivized to give poor people better paying jobs when it does not actively benefit them. When companies create job opportunities in rural areas, this only looks like jobs such as working in factories with no skill necessary. This makes them more prone and vulnerable to job automation and losing their job in the case of crises. This does not look like a stable income. Their side does not help the poor. Their side is simply making the poor prone to exploitation and from companies with minimum wage jobs. So now I'd like to move on to this debate's first clash on a sustainable path for development in our world. First of all, on international interest. Our side builds a much more developed city center that would become a hub for global interest and investments. Due to the consistent amount of people staying in these larger cities, it makes an obvious interest for government funding. The government funds would be concentrated in these urban areas, which would further promote innovation and efficiency. This is an exclusive benefit due to the fact that Gov's world would force the government to spread their funds to both the urban city and also to the rural areas. This results in not enough money to both effectively develop the urban area and also make a proper foundation for the rural area. Therefore, our side is able to cost effectively develop urban areas. To digress, our side is able to, with this concentrated government fund, attract more international interest and investments. When we create this kind of stable city center, this helps other countries recognize that this country is capable of stable, healthy, and long-term development. This is exactly what makes a hub for global investments. This would create a constant cycle of funds from the government and also globally, which is crucial for creating a stable country that is constantly developing. Secondly, on better welfare and infrastructure, Gov's side has constantly been talking about how our side leaves behind poorer people. However, our side is actually the flip case, and this is because when the government is also concentrating their funds for the development, they also see that more poorer people are also staying in these urban cities. This would then incentivize them to fund better welfare concentrated only to the urban city. This means better developed welfare also for the poor individuals in our world, so Gov's case doesn't stand. Finally, on low risk, our side generally allows lower risk for crises to happen when we are concentrated into this developed city center. This is likely as a larger city has enough money to reduce their hit from crises and not be affected. However, when a rural area is hit with a crises, they do not have enough infrastructure and proper funding to take this hit. It is simply harder for the government to prevent both rural and urban areas from crises in Gov's world. First of all, so now I'd like to move on to this debate's second clash on the vulnerability of rural areas. First of all, on inflation. First of all, on the lack of ability to adapt. We believe that GovSide makes these poor people even more vulnerable to things such as automation and job loss. What a lot of countries have done in developed rural areas have only resulted in a lot of factories. On our side, it would simply look like companies going into rural areas and building factories for unskilled labor. On their side, it would simply look like companies going into rural areas and building factories for unskilled labor. This is a likely framing, as poor people are likely to move to these areas, as even Gov has explained, and simply because they need the money. These poor people would fall into further manipulation and exploitation of these companies, who would underpay them for hours and hours of their days being consumed by working at a factory that does not even allow them to properly support themselves or a family. This makes them much more vulnerable to automation when the only job opportunities in these rural areas are polarization. As our deputy speaker has emphasized in their speech, their side is not protecting poor people. They're pushing poor people into rural areas with the excuse of developing them. When there is a sudden influx of poor people going to these rural areas, it is likely that inflation would happen due to the sudden increase of demand and the lack of sufficient supply. As these poor people are already exploited by the companies, it is likely that they would not have any incentive to vote or be educated on politics, as they are struggling to support themselves. This makes them much more vulnerable to politicians simply ignoring them and leaving them behind. Their side further robs people of jobs and rights. So for all these reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you for
Government
listening.
loses at the end of the day because of the simple fact that they fail to engage in the most of the harms that we present to you. Let me reiterate each point that the government states, how they've been defeated, and which materials we present that still stands at the end of the day. 4 points to mention here. 1, they constantly state that it is rather better to live a stable life with low-paying jobs rather than living as a homeless person in an urban area. This is the characterization that they use straight from the PM till the end. The reason why we don't engage with this statement is that we already proved to you can't literally have a stable life in a rural area in their world. We literally give you four analysis that proves how rural areas are so economically damaged that they can't have a so-called stable life. Just for the sake of reminder, we would like to tell you what we stated. Firstly, we literally told you that these people who are usually poor and so desperate who move to these rural areas are most likely not going to be the ones that are able to lead the development there, which is because of the fact that they have limited education and they have a limited skill set, which just decreases the fact that they're able to succeed in these rural areas. And secondly, we also tell you that rural areas in the status quo stagnates economically, and conservative political ideologies and primal industries won't be able to adapt to technology and those urban areas, even if they're given so much economic benefit. And we also tell you that rural areas are likely to become the ones that massively rely on the national governments because of this exact same characterization. And lastly, we also tell you the most important thing about this is inflation and foreign companies coming there to destroy the local economy and taking advantage of the poor state of these. And this is given that we are most generous and we do concede with their model. And these 4 reasons are the reason why we win this clash, and they never reply or rebutted to any of these. And this is the reason why we also say that this clash is the reason why we win the debate, even if we lose all of the other clashes, because the most vulnerable stakeholders of this debate, the poor people in the rural areas, are the most important vulnerable stakeholders that we protect by stating that their world provides a worse characterization, while we say that our world, at least we have a better world for them, because we don't further the poverty that already exists in these rural areas. And we say that even if the benefits here are lost, we still win because their benefits are completely defined and harms. Secondly, we also say that people in rural areas are quite literally suffering with people who are likely to suffer in both worlds. It is likely that, at least in our world, some of these individuals are likely to move to urban areas as they see that there's better welfare and help. As our previous speakers have constantly explained again and again, at least our side is able to help these individuals, while government's world would only incentivize more people to move to rural areas, resulting in further exploitation of these individuals. As we have constantly told you, poor people would fall further vulnerable into companies taking advantage of them, and diverse isn't a good thing. It actually it loses the cost efficiency, because you now have to take care of every single rural areas that exist in your world. And lastly, opposition says that private corporations will move to these rural areas and somehow work hand in hand with government. Firstly, their team haven't mechanized the incentive, and even if not we believe that we still win the debate at the end of the day because of the previous clash, since that we win at the end of the day. Thank you.
Panel, knowing the fact that our side is the only side that really prioritizes these poor people, while their side runs on all of these these long-term impacts, opposition is the only side that really protects these people. But firstly, right, let's look at the really big strategical mistakes, right? Not the fact that all of the ideas of all of these inflations, they're much, much less urgent, and they're much, much less urgent than, for example, the ideas that we brought up during, for example, proposition, right? That is to say, the ideas about these people literally lying out there, being homeless, right? Literally going to die out there in the next 3 days, as stated again and again, right? So the amount of urgency there is in this debate is much more to the proposition side. Right? But secondly, right, not the fact that they constantly argue about if being homeless is much better than having a job maybe for a few days, right? Sure, right? Sure, right? Maybe on our side, your job is not stable, right? But even if you lose your job, as stated before, you return to your original state, right? That is to say that you don't really lose everything, right? So at the end of the day, we believe that, as stated before, rather you have a job for a few days than just being homeless for the rest of your life with no hope, right? This has been constantly mentioned and really pinged on by proposition whip, right? Now we cleared everything in this debate. Let's really compare two sides as the reply speaker. Right? Well, opposition comes out here and tries to run a huge amount of long-term impacts, such as, for example, after a few months, and what if at least, for example, automations, at the end of the day, our side can still prove that it's so much better for these people, right? That is to say that OpWeb has already proved time and time again that rather if you have a job, sure, it might be only a few days, it's much better for you to have no job, no life, and be stuck in the urban city. This point they barely even mention, and they do not really interact with. So we win on this point, and this one would prove very detrimental to their case, right? Why is that so, right? Because this is the most vulnerable stakeholder from this debate from the get-go, right? From the get-go, we have already framed these people to be extremely vulnerable and to be the people that needs to be protected, right? So their side, not protecting these people, nor do they really rephrase it, or nor do they really reframe it, is a very big strategical mistake in which we would use, right? But continuing on, right? We also see that, for example, on their side, not the fact that at the end, all their responses were extremely negative, right? They don't really provide that much, for example, positive material, right? Which is another big strategical mistake in which we also use on, right? And finally, right, on the final comparison between the two sides, on opposition, we have a case in which, for example, really revolves around, for example, all these stakeholders, but never ever revolves around, for example, the most important stakeholder, right? And even when they try to defend it, and even when they try to win that stakeholder, we still win this debate because they never rebutted or they never try to really combat, for example, our main case, they just blatantly say that, this is much better or this is not better, right? Panel, you believe the side which has more mechanisms and proves how this vulnerable stakeholder is the best and lives a best life. Opposition does that.